Why did the room go quiet the moment she stepped inside, even though no one knew her name yet? She felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift, conversations thinning, laughter cutting short, not because of respect, because of uncertainty. Riley Keene moved through the corridor with a single duffel on her shoulder, boots striking concrete at an unhurried pace. No entourage, no ceremony, just another officer if you didn't know what to look for, and most people didn't. The base sat at the edge of nowhere, the kind of installation built to be forgotten unless something went wrong. Concrete structures, faded signage, floodlights that hummed louder than they should. Officially, she was here for oversight, training integration, readiness evaluations, the kind of assignment that sounded harmless enough to keep curiosity low. That was the point. The real orders were sealed, heavy paper, restricted markings, authority that didn't announce itself until it was too late to stop it. Riley had learned long ago that predators didn't look like monsters. They looked like men who smiled easily, who blended in, who relied on routines and silence and systems designed to protect themselves. She'd dismantled networks like that before, overseas in places where the enemy wore different uniforms. This one was closer, harder, because it hid behind familiarity. As she walked, her eyes tracked exits, camera angles, blind corners, the distance between doors. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit, survival etched into muscle memory. "Quiet," the duty officer said cheerfully. Riley didn't answer. Quiet had never meant safe. That night, she chose the recovery wing. It was after hours, mostly empty, poorly lit, a forgotten part of the base that existed in paperwork more than practice. Cameras listed as operational but angled wrong. Locks repaired just enough to pass inspection. Places like this always told the truth if you listened closely enough. She did. A broken latch, tool marks, a sign printed too recently to be honest, words carved into wood that weren't jokes, weren't graffiti, warnings disguised as cruelty. She stood there longer than necessary, something tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She'd seen this pattern before, different names, same silence. Riley moved deliberately, bag down, towel folded, boots aligned, not ritual readiness. She didn't come to work out, she came to be seen. The footsteps came without subtlety, 4 of them, confident, unafraid. That alone told her everything. They thought this space belonged to them. She didn't turn right away. When she did, their faces were already shaped by expectation. A woman alone, cornered. The math was simple in their minds, it always was. "You're alone," one of them said, smiling like it was an invitation. Riley met his eyes calmly. Stillness wasn't weakness, but they didn't know that yet. They crowded closer, blocking exits. One raised a phone, camera lights sharp and invasive. Another laughed too loudly. One hung back, already thinking about deniability. "Scream," one of them whispered. The word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was meant to humiliate, to remind her of where they thought her place was. Riley felt the familiar switch inside her, not anger, not panic, focus, cold, procedural. When the first hand touched her, everything changed. The strike was precise, efficient, no wasted motion, training over instinct. Ruiz went down gasping, nerves shut off before pain could even register. The room rewrote itself in seconds. The phone kept recording. The second man lunged out of pride more than sense. He folded just as quickly. The third froze. The fourth ran and stopped when she decided he would. In under a minute, the space belonged to her. She picked up the phone calmly, saved the file. Evidence mattered more than dominance, always had. They stared at her now differently, fear replacing entitlement, reality cracking illusion. "You think I'm here by accident?" she asked quietly. No one answered. Security arrived fast, confusion followed. Accusations spilled clumsily, already collapsing under their own weight. Riley didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue, she presented credentials. The air changed. Clearance levels did that, so did calm certainty. The video played. Truth doesn't need embellishment, it just needs to be seen. Detainment orders followed, then silence, heavy, final. By morning, whispers moved faster than official statements. Women spoke quietly to each other. Old footage resurfaced. Complaints once buried found oxygen. Riley didn't sleep. She worked. Patterns emerged, transfers, informal notes, names recurring like scars. This wasn't one incident, it never was. It was a system that had learned how to look away. At sunrise, she stood in the base commander's office, file thick with proof. "You didn't ask," she said simply, when he claimed ignorance. Silence can be a decision. Access was granted, reviews ordered, rotations frozen, protections installed not as gestures but mechanisms. The men were removed, the culture exposed. No speeches followed, no ceremonies. But something shifted. Women walked differently, not triumphant, cautiously hopeful, watching to see if it would last. Riley left the way she arrived, quietly, duffel on her shoulder, no applause, no acknowledgement needed. Some battles aren't about force, they're about refusal. Refusal to look away, refusal to stay silent, refusal to let dignity be negotiated. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did she choose the one place on base everyone avoided after dark? Riley Keene stood just outside the recovery wing longer than necessary, not because she hesitated but because she listened. Buildings spoke if you gave them time. Pipes ticked as they cooled. Ventilation hummed unevenly. Somewhere far off, a metal door slammed, then echoed again, softer this time. The kind of sound that told you someone was moving with purpose, not routine. She learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself. It waited. It assumed you wouldn't notice. The corridor light flickered once as she stepped inside. Not enough to fail inspection. Just enough to remind anyone paying attention that maintenance here was cosmetic. The air smelled clean in the way erased places always did, disinfectant layered too thick, covering something older. Beneath it, sweat, old tile, fear that had nowhere to go. Riley adjusted the strap of her duffel and walked at a pace that suggested nothing more than fatigue. No scanning, no visible alertness. She let her shoulders drop, posture loose, almost careless. It wasn't acting. It was control. She had learned that predators didn't test strength first. They tested availability. The locker corridor stretched ahead, narrow and poorly renovated, mirrors cracked at the edges like they'd survived arguments no one recorded. She noted the blind spots automatically, counted steps, marked exits. Her mind did it without asking permission. Ignored. That was the feeling sitting deepest in her chest. Not tonight, not in this moment, but layered there from years of rooms where her voice had been noted politely and dismissed quietly. Briefings where she'd been the only woman at the table and the first assumption was that she was support, or visiting, or lost. She had stopped correcting people a long time ago. Correction wasted energy. Evidence didn't. She passed the bench again. The carved words caught the light just enough to be legible if you knew where to look. She read them once more, slowly, letting the weight settle instead of pushing it away. She shouldn't have cried. Riley's jaw tightened, not in anger, in recognition. Whoever carved that hadn't been dramatic, they'd been exhausted. She set her bag down, folded her towel, lined her boots with quiet precision. Each movement grounded her, kept her breathing steady. She could feel the old ache in her shoulder from an injury that never quite healed right. It flared sometimes when the weather shifted. Tonight, it stayed quiet, like it understood this wasn't about pain. She stripped down to what was necessary. No rush, no tension in her hands. She wanted whoever was watching to feel comfortable, to feel validated in their assumptions. Stillness, she knew, was often mistaken for fear. The door opened behind her with a sound too confident to be accidental. 4 sets of footsteps entered the corridor, not spaced evenly, not cautious. 1 stayed near the entrance. 2 advanced. 1 drifted just enough to cut off escape without making it obvious. Riley didn't turn right away. She let them see her back, let the silence stretch, let them decide who she was before she ever looked at them. When she did turn, their faces told her everything she needed to know. Amusement first, then appraisal, then possession. "Look what wandered in," one of them said, voice light, almost playful. Riley met his gaze without blinking. She didn't cover herself. She didn't shrink. She simply stood there, breathing evenly, eyes steady. She could feel her pulse, slow and controlled, like it was waiting for permission. Another stepped closer, too close, invading space deliberately, testing reaction. "You knew?" he asked. "Haven't seen you around." "I know where I am," Riley replied. Her voice was level, not challenging, not submissive, just factual. They laughed, not because it was funny, because laughter reinforced hierarchy, because it filled silence they didn't want questioned. "After hours is our time," the one with the phone said, lifting it casually. Camera light flared, harsh and sudden. "You should have checked the schedule." Riley felt something cold slide into place behind her ribs. Not fear, clarity. The phone mattered. The recording mattered. She stored that thought carefully and kept her face neutral. "You know," the tall one continued, stepping into her space like he owned it, "these walls are thick. Pipes are loud. We've tested it." The word landed unspoken between them. "Scream." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was delivered like a certainty. Riley inhaled slowly through her nose. She thought briefly of a briefing years ago in a windowless room overseas, where a man twice her size had told her she didn't belong on that mission. She outperformed him without raising her voice. This felt similar. Smaller stakes on paper, bigger ones underneath. "Turn it off," she said quietly, nodding toward the phone. The man blinked. Surprise flickered across his face, then amusement sharpened it. "Or what?" Riley didn't answer immediately. She looked at each of them instead. Catalogued posture, weight distribution, the slight tremor in one man's hand, the way another avoided eye contact like he already knew this was wrong but lacked the spine to leave. "Or you'll spend the rest of your life explaining this moment," she said. That earned a scoff, a step closer, the sound of confidence breaking rules. The first hand grabbed her shoulder. The world narrowed. Training took over where emotion would have slowed her down. She didn't think in words. She thought in angles, leverage, timing. The joint at the base of his thumb gave way under her grip. His breath left him in a sharp, surprised sound as her elbow struck precisely where it needed to. Not rage, mechanics. He went down hard, confusion written across his face before pain caught up. The others froze for half a heartbeat, long enough. The second charged without thinking. Pride made him careless. Riley sidestepped, used his momentum, and dropped him with brutal efficiency. His phone clattered to the floor, still recording, red dot blinking like an accusation. The third man didn't move. His bravado collapsed inward. Eyes wide, mouth open, he looked young suddenly, fragile, like he just realized what side of the room he was actually on. The fourth ran. Riley let him take 2 steps, just enough to commit. Then she intercepted him, spun him into the wall with controlled force, not enough to injure, enough to end resistance. "Hands on the wall," she ordered. He obeyed immediately. The corridor fell silent except for ragged breathing and the faint hum of the lights. Riley stood there barefoot on cold tile, heart steady, pulse controlled. She felt the weight of the moment press down on her shoulders, not adrenaline but consequence. She crossed a line they never expected her to cross. Not violence, authority. She picked up the phone, checked the screen, saved the file. Evidence before emotion, always. "You think I'm here by accident?" she asked them. No one answered. When security arrived, confusion followed fast and sloppy. Accusations came too loud, too rehearsed. Riley didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She let them speak themselves into corners. She produced her identification calmly. The shift was immediate. Rank did that, clearance did more. The recording erased doubt entirely. Detainment orders were issued, voices lowered, postures changed. The men who'd filled the space minutes earlier now looked smaller, diminished by the weight of reality. As they were escorted away, Riley felt something unexpected tug at her chest. Not satisfaction, not relief. Sadness. Because she knew this wasn't the first time. And it wouldn't be the last unless the system itself was forced to look at what it had allowed. She stayed behind after the corridor emptied, collected her things, folded the towel again, put her boots back on. Her hands shook just slightly as the adrenaline faded. She let it happen, didn't shame herself for it. Strength wasn't the absence of reaction. It was choosing what you did with it. As she stepped back into the night air, the base quiet and unaware of how close it had come to staying exactly the same, Riley looked up once at the floodlights humming overhead. Ignored systems created monsters. And tonight, one of them had finally been seen. Why did the silence after the boots faded feel heavier than the violence itself? Riley Keene stood alone in the recovery wing long after the corridor had emptied, the echoes of raised voices and hurried commands dissolving into the hum of ventilation. The space looked smaller now, not because it had changed, but because it no longer belonged to anyone pretending it was harmless. The benches were just benches again, the lockers just metal and dense, but the air still carried the residue of what had almost happened and what had finally stopped happening. Her hands trembled once as she relaced her boots. She let them. Adrenaline always left something behind. Anyone who claimed otherwise was lying or already broken. Riley had learned not to punish herself for the aftershocks. She focused on breathing instead, in through the nose, out slow. Control returned the way it always did, gradual, earned. By the time she stepped outside, the night had cooled. Floodlights buzzed above the yard, casting long shadows across concrete that had seen decades of routine but very little truth. Somewhere on base, a radio crackled. Somewhere else, a door slammed too hard. Life continuing, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. She walked back to her office without escort. That alone said enough. Inside, she locked the door, set the duffel down, and finally pulled out the sealed folder. The paper inside was heavier than it should have been, thick with authority that never asked permission. She opened it slowly, like rereading a sentence that had already changed your life. Immediate action authorized. No prior notification required. Riley closed her eyes for a moment. She had known this would come, had suspected it, even hoped for it in a grim, reluctant way. Still, the weight of being right settled into her chest with a dull ache. Being proven right never felt like victory when the cost was people who had suffered quietly before the proof arrived. She turned on her laptop and began uploading the video. File names mattered. Timestamps mattered. Chains of custody mattered. She labeled everything with care, as if precision itself were a form of respect for those who hadn't been believed before. As the progress bar crawled forward, memories surfaced uninvited. A young corporal overseas, hands shaking as she reported something that wasn't worth ruining a career over. A pilot who'd requested reassignment twice before finally resigning, blamed for being difficult. A sniper Riley had trained with who never explained why she stopped sleeping. Patterns didn't scream, they whispered, and systems trained people not to listen. By 300, the first anonymous statement came in. Then another. Then another. Riley didn't react outwardly. She simply read, slowly, carefully, each account distinct but threaded with the same undertone: hesitation, self-doubt, the fear of being labeled the problem instead of the crime. One message stopped her longer than the rest. I thought it was normal. I thought this was just how it worked. I didn't know I was allowed to say no. Riley leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly, irritating in a way she usually ignored. Tonight, it felt personal. Allowed. That word lingered. She'd heard it before, too many times. Permission framed as privilege. Safety framed as accommodation. By dawn, the folder on her desk had grown thick with digital weight, screenshots, logs, timestamps, names recurring in ways that were impossible to explain away. Transfers that lined up too neatly. Complaints marked informal and quietly closed. Counseling referrals without follow-up. This wasn't negligence anymore. It was design. At 700, she stood outside the base commander's office, the morning routine unfolding around her like nothing had changed. Cadence calls echoed from the yard. Boots thudded in unison. Someone laughed near the chow hall. The door opened. Colonel Keating looked up, already tired, like a man who sensed his day was about to break open. Riley didn't waste time. She placed the file on his desk and waited. He flipped through the pages at first with practiced detachment, then slower, then not at all. His jaw tightened. The color drained from his face incrementally, the way it did when truth arrived without warning. "This isn't official yet," he said finally, voice thin. "It will be," Riley replied. Her tone wasn't sharp, it didn't need to be. "I didn't know," he said. "You didn't ask." The words weren't cruel, they were precise, that was worse. Silence stretched between them, thick with the realization that ignorance could no longer be worn as armor. Outside, a formation called Cadence louder, oblivious. "What do you want from me?" Keating asked. Riley slid a second envelope across the desk. Access authorizations, oversight mandates, names that went higher than either of them. This wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about exposure. "I want this system open," she said, "all of it. No local filters, no courtesy warnings." He nodded slowly, too slowly. "And the men?" he asked. "Removed immediately." No argument this time. As she turned to leave, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not defiance, but something closer to shame. Riley recognized it. She'd seen it in herself once years ago when she realized competence without courage was just another form of failure. Outside, the base looked the same. But people didn't. Word moved quietly, not rumors, confirmation. Women passed each other in hallways and held eye contact a second longer. Some nodded, some didn't trust it yet. Hope learned caution early. Riley noticed a young private standing straighter than before. Another who hesitated, then relaxed her shoulders as Riley walked past. These were small things, fragile things. They mattered. That evening, Riley returned briefly to the recovery wing, not to investigate, just to stand there, to let the space be a space again. The carved words were still there. She traced them once with her eyes, committing them to memory. Systems could be changed, but scars needed time. As she left, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired, grounded, aware that accountability was not a moment but a process that demanded vigilance long after the headlines faded. Strength wasn't about winning fights. It was about staying present when it would be easier to leave. And tonight, for the first time in a long while, Riley allowed herself to believe that staying might actually matter. Why did the bass feel louder the morning after nothing was officially announced? Riley noticed it the moment she stepped outside. Voices carried farther than usual, boots struck pavement harder, laughter came a fraction too late. The routines were the same, but the rhythm was off. That was how change announced itself in places built on repetition, not with speeches, with tension. She walked past the training yard as platoons formed lines under a pale sky. No one stopped her. A few glanced her way, then looked forward again. Others watched openly, curiosity outweighing caution. She didn't return their looks. She learned that being seen too clearly too soon turned people defensive. Let them decide what she was on their own. In her office, the secure inbox was already full. Statements, follow-ups, questions phrased carefully enough to sound professional while carrying fear underneath. Riley read each one slowly. She didn't skim. Skimming felt like dismissal, and she refused to repeat the same harm with better intentions. One message came from a senior NCO. Male, careful tone, respectful but edged with something like self-protection. "Ma'am, I believe there may have been behavior in my unit I should have addressed sooner." Should have. Riley leaned back in her chair, eyes closing for a brief moment. Regret after exposure always arrived dressed as accountability. Sometimes it was genuine. Sometimes it was just late. Her job wasn't to judge intent. It was to verify action. She typed a response requesting specifics, documentation, dates. Facts over feelings, always. As the morning unfolded, the consequences began stacking quietly. 3 training rotations paused. 2 mentorship assignments frozen pending review. Legal requested copies of the footage with original metadata intact. Counseling services expanded walk-in hours without public explanation. The base wasn't in chaos. It was adjusting. That unsettled people more than alarms ever could. By midday, Riley was called to a meeting she hadn't requested. A conference room with too many chairs and not enough air. Officers filed in one by one, some stiff with formality, others attempting casual smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She took a seat near the end of the table. "Let them underestimate you," an old instructor's voice echoed in her memory. "It saves time later." The colonel spoke first, measured and official, outlining the review process like it had always been planned this way. Riley listened without interrupting. She noticed who nodded automatically and who avoided eye contact, who took notes, who didn't. When the floor opened for questions, silence lingered. Then one captain cleared his throat. "Ma'am, with respect, don't you think this could damage morale?" Riley turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. "Which morale?" she asked. "The one built on silence or the one built on safety?" No one spoke. She didn't press. The question did its own work. Another officer asked about scope, about timelines, about whether this was temporary or permanent. Riley answered each calmly without embellishment. She didn't threaten careers. She described processes, systems, oversight mechanisms that outlasted individuals. By the time the meeting adjourned, no one felt reassured. That was good. Real accountability wasn't comforting. It was clarifying. Later that afternoon, Riley walked past the barracks and saw something that stopped her mid-step. A young woman stood near the entrance arguing quietly with a man in uniform. Not heated, controlled, firm, her shoulders were squared, her hands steady. When the man scoffed and turned away, she didn't shrink. She exhaled once visibly and kept walking. Riley felt a tightness in her chest she hadn't expected. Hope, she realized, was dangerous like that. It crept in when you weren't watching. That evening, she received a message marked priority. Recovered file, prior incident, same location. Riley opened it. The footage was grainy, poorly framed, shaky, but unmistakable. The same corridor, the same locker benches, a different woman, younger, cornered. The audio cut in and out, but the tone was clear even without words. Riley closed the file slowly. This was the part no one talked about, the accumulation. The way each unaddressed incident stacked on the next, until the weight became unbearable for those carrying it alone. She forwarded the file to legal, then to the external review board, flagged urgent. Then she sat there, hands folded, staring at nothing. For the first time since arriving, the anger surfaced. Not explosive, not blinding, focused. It settled in her gut like a promise. That night she dreamed of water. Cold, dark, closing over her head. She woke before panic set in, heart pounding, sheets twisted around her legs. Dreams were funny that way, your mind processing things you refused to during the day. She showered longer than usual. Let the water ground her. Let it wash away the residue of other people's fear clinging to her skin. By morning, the base commander requested another meeting. This time his tone was different, less defensive, more resigned. "We've identified additional personnel for review," he said, sliding a list across the desk. Names Riley had already flagged. "Good," she replied simply. He hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "Do you ever get tired of this?" The question surprised her. "Yes," she said honestly, then added, "but not as tired as I'd be if I didn't do it." He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to. As the day wore on, Riley noticed subtle shifts. Jokes stopped mid-sentence. Doors remained open a little longer. People thought before speaking, not out of fear, out of awareness. Awareness was the first crack in any broken system. Late afternoon, she returned to the recovery wing with facilities management. Orders were issued to repair locks, reposition cameras, improve lighting, practical steps, necessary ones. But as the maintenance crew worked, Riley stood back and watched. Fixing infrastructure was easy. Fixing trust was. A female corporal approached hesitantly, eyes flicking toward the crew before settling on Riley. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you." Riley studied her for a moment, saw the caution there, the disbelief that this might be real. "You don't owe me thanks," Riley replied. "You owed yourself safety. This place failed you. We're correcting that." The corporal nodded, swallowing hard, then walked away quickly, like staying too long might jinx it. As evening fell, Riley sat alone in her office again, typing her daily report. It was dry, procedural, purposefully unremarkable. Paperwork was how justice survived scrutiny. She paused before closing the file, fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel proud. Not of the takedown, not of authority asserted, but of restraint, of choosing process over impulse, of holding the line when it would have been easier to walk away after the first win. She shut down the computer and leaned back, exhaustion settling into her bones. Tomorrow would bring resistance, appeals, subtle pushback disguised as policy questions. Change always provoked defense. But tonight the base was different. Not healed. Aware. And sometimes, awareness was the most dangerous thing of all to those who relied on darkness to survive. Why did the smallest question unsettle her more than any confrontation had? It came quietly, slipped into her thoughts while she was reviewing transfer logs late that night. A single line in an otherwise routine file. Requested reassignment, reason withheld. Riley stared at the screen longer than necessary. She'd seen that phrasing hundreds of times. It was the administrative equivalent of a closed door. Clean, polite, empty. It meant someone had decided that telling the truth cost more than leaving. She saved the document and leaned back in her chair, the muscles in her neck finally protesting the hours she'd ignored them. Outside, the base had settled into its nocturnal rhythm. Engines cooling, distant laughter fatting, a radio squawk somewhere, then silence again. This was the part no one prepared you for. Not the confrontation, not the paperwork, but the quiet aftermath when the adrenaline wore off and all that remained was the weight of what had been revealed. Accountability was loud at first, then it became lonely. Riley stood and stretched, rolling her shoulders carefully. The old injury flared, just a warning, nothing more. Her body had learned to speak in small signals. She listened. On impulse, she stepped outside, letting the cool night air cut through the recycled office stillness. The floodlights cast pale halos across the walkways. A pair of junior enlisted past her, mid-conversation. They stopped when they noticed her rank, straightened instinctively, then relaxed when she nodded and kept walking. She wondered what stories they'd heard already, which version of events was making the rounds. The truth, she'd learned, never traveled alone. It picked up interpretations, agendas, fears. She didn't try to control that. Control was fragile, systems were stronger. As she walked, a memory surfaced uninvited. Her first deployment years ago, standing on a tarmac at dawn, helmet too big, heart too loud. She'd been terrified then, not of dying, of failing, of confirming every quiet doubt that whispered she didn't belong there. She survived that fear by becoming precise, by knowing her job better than anyone else in the room. Precision had kept her alive. It had also kept her distant. Tonight, distance felt heavier than usual. Back in her office, the inbox chimed again. Another message, this one longer, a female sergeant, careful wording but firm. I didn't report because I didn't want to be known as the problem. I see now that silence didn't protect me. It protected them. Riley closed her eyes. There it was. The core of it. Predators thrived not on violence alone, but on isolation. On convincing their targets that speaking up would cost more than enduring. Systems didn't have to be cruel to enable that. They just had to be indifferent. She typed a response personally, breaking protocol just enough to matter. She acknowledged the message, confirmed receipt, explained next steps, not as a commander, as a human being. When she sent it, she felt something ease in her chest she hadn't realized was tight. The next morning brought resistance. Not open defiance. That was rare. Resistance arrived in subtler forms, questions framed as concerns, delays disguised as procedural necessity, requests for clarification that asked the same thing 3 different ways in hopes of exhausting the answer. Riley handled each with calm persistence. She met with legal, then medical, then chaplain services. She insisted on external interviewers, independent review, no internal handling. Each insistence was met with a polite smile that barely concealed frustration. "You're moving very fast," one officer remarked. "I'm moving at the speed of evidence," Riley replied. That ended the discussion. By midday, word came that one of the detained men had requested to speak, claimed he had information, wanted a deal. Riley declined the meeting. Not because she wasn't curious, but because she knew the tactic. Confession framed as leverage. Cooperation offered only when consequences became unavoidable. Truth didn't need bargaining chips. Later, as she crossed the admin wing, she noticed a young woman sitting on a bench outside the counseling office. Hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. She looked up when Riley passed, recognition flickering across her face. For a split second, Riley considered stopping, saying something, anything. She didn't. Instead, she slowed just enough to meet the woman's gaze and nod once. Not a command, not reassurance, acknowledgement. The woman's shoulders dropped slightly, like she'd been holding her breath. Sometimes that was all you could offer, proof that someone saw you. That evening, Riley finally allowed herself to feel tired. The kind of tired that seeped into your bones, not from physical exertion but from vigilance. From carrying other people's stories carefully, making sure none of them were dropped or mishandled. She returned to her quarters earlier than usual, sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. The room felt unfamiliar despite the days she'd spent there. Temporary spaces always did. She lived out of duffels for so long that permanence made her uneasy. She thought of home, of a place she rarely visited because stillness made memories louder, of relationships that hadn't survived her absences or her silences. Sacrifice was often romanticized. No one talked about the quiet erosion. Her phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number routed through official channels. "Thank you for not looking away." No name, no rank. Riley stared at the screen, throat tightening unexpectedly. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed that. Not praise, confirmation. She set the phone down and lay back, staring at the ceiling until the lines blurred. Sleep came unevenly. When she woke, it was to sunlight spilling across the floor and the faint sound of cadence in the distance. Another day. Another set of decisions that would ripple outward in ways she'd never fully see. At the morning briefing, the colonel announced the formation of an external review board. Formal language, neutral tone, but beneath it, an undercurrent of finality. This wasn't going away. Riley watched faces around the room, some tense, some relieved, some unreadable. Change always rearranged loyalties. After the briefing, a lieutenant approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I didn't realize how much stuff was getting ignored. I thought if it was serious, someone would have handled it." Riley studied him for a moment. He looked genuinely shaken, not defensive, not dismissive, just disillusioned. "That belief," she said quietly, "is how it keeps happening." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. As he walked away, Riley felt a cautious sense of resolve settle in. This wasn't just about removing a few bad actors. It was about dismantling a belief system that told people harm was inevitable and accountability optional. Late that afternoon, she stood once more at the edge of the training yard, watching recruits run drills under the watchful eyes of their instructors. Sweat, shouts, discipline, structure. The institution wasn't evil, but it was powerful. And power unchecked, always bent toward abuse. Riley turned away before the thought hardened into bitterness. She wasn't here to tear the place down. She was here to remind it what it claimed to stand for. And even as exhaustion tugged at her, even as the weight of unfinished work pressed down, she felt something steadier underneath it all. Determination. Quiet, unyielding. The kind that didn't need to be seen to keep moving forward. Why did it feel harder to leave than it ever had to arrive? Riley Keene stood by the window of her office long before sunrise, watching the base wake up one restrained movement at a time. Lights clicked on in distant buildings. A maintenance truck rolled past, tires hissing softly against concrete. Somewhere, a whistle cut through the morning air, sharp and familiar. Routine reasserting itself as it always did. The world loved patterns. People depended on them. She rested her forehead lightly against the cool glass. This was usually the moment she looked forward to, the end of assignment stillness, when the work was done and the consequences were someone else's responsibility. She'd always been good at that part, finishing the job, walking away clean, but this time something resisted. The review board had been convened. External investigators were already on base. Digital records duplicated, sealed, mirrored. Legal had taken over custody of the evidence. The men who thought the recovery wing belonged to them were no longer names spoken casually. They were case numbers now. Process had teeth. On paper, the mission was complete. Inside her chest, it felt unfinished. Her phone vibrated once on the desk behind her. A message from the base commander, brief and formal, confirming her departure window and thanking her for her service. She read it without expression and set the phone face down. Service was a complicated word. It sounded clean, noble, but service rarely felt that way when you were inside it. It felt like compromise, like standing in rooms where people nodded at the right times but hoped you'd leave before things got uncomfortable, like carrying truths that didn't belong to you but refused to be ignored. Riley turned away from the window and began packing slowly. She folded each item with care, not because she was meticulous, but because order steadied her thoughts. The sealed folder went in last. It was thinner now, most of its contents transferred to other hands, but it still carried weight. Authority wasn't something you shed just because the assignment ended. As she zipped the duffel closed, a knock came at the door. She hesitated, then opened it. A woman stood there, senior enlisted, maybe mid-30s, posture straight but not rigid. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes gave her away. Nervous, determined. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I was told you're leaving today." Riley nodded. "That's right." The woman shifted her weight, clearly rehearsing whatever came next. I wanted to thank you in person.